Hello and welcome to the presentation for week 8. Because it is week 8, I feel like it's worth pointing out that we are at the end of this week going to be halfway through the semester. So if you feel like you've hung on to this point, chances are that you're in the home stretch now. Um, so this week we're talking about Sula and Sula's author, Toni Morrison, much in the same way that I said about Winesburg, Ohio, that it is probably the greatest sort of great book on the syllabus for the semester. I think there's an argument to be made that Toni Morrison is probably the greatest of the great authors on the list. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Just some background information on Toni Morrison. She was actually not born Toni Morrison. She was born Chloe Ardelia Wofford in Lorain, Ohio in 1931. I believe that her name was actually changed to Antonio or something like that when she was baptized Catholic a little bit later in life. And then Morrison was actually her married name. Um, so she majored in English at Howard University. And after majoring in English at Howard, she worked as an editor for Random House. So she actually got an opportunity to sort of see how the publishing industry worked from the inside. Um, and she is probably best known for some of her novels, particularly The Bluest Eye, Sula, which we're reading, Song of Solomon, Beloved, which a lot of people believe to be her greatest work, and a novel called Tar Baby, which is also the name of a character in this book. Um, so that's a little bit of background on her. A little bit more background, more specifically literary background. As I said, Toni Morrison is, well, I would argue that she, as I think my third bullet point says, probably she's our greatest living American writer. Certainly, she takes her place in the pantheon of all-time great American writers. But as far as writers actively publishing today, which she still is, I don't think there's anybody else that really compares. I always like to sort of talk about the awards that authors have won for their work. Hers include some of the usual suspects: the National Book Critics Award, Critics Circle Award, the American Book Award, and what would normally be the crowning achievement for an author, the Pulitzer Prize. But for Toni Morrison, that was just sort of warm up because then she won the Nobel Prize in Literature, which I think she's the only American to do it in the last 30 years or something like that. Her work centers primarily on the Black American experience, and it usually works to further establish the literary significance of that experience. If you read the introduction, you know that Morrison was sort of coming into her own in the 60s in a time where the Academy and sort of literary scholars were opening up to Black American literature in ways that they wouldn't have even, say, 10 years earlier. But other than a lot of writers from sort of from sort of the Harlem Renaissance and that period, there weren't as many people being studied, and those that were being studied primarily politically. Their work was being studied exclusively as sort of speaking for or commenting on the Black experience. And Morrison, I think, is the first of a new generation of writers that really combined that political interest with just truly great writing that was worth studying purely from a literary point of view as well. Um, and so it took her a while to rise to prominence, but she did eventually get there. And now, as I said, she probably is lauded as our great American writer. She taught at various universities for years, and I think she recently retired from teaching. I'm sure she is still an emeritus professor at one or more schools. But that's sort of the background of Toni Morrison. So a bit about Sula specifically, I guess generally specifically, before we get into the sort of chapter by chapter specifics. It was published in 1973, so it was, I believe, her second novel after The Bluest Eye. So this is from fairly early in Toni Morrison's career. And it's set prior to that. It's set in the first half of the 20th century. I think the novel runs from 1919 or so to the 1940s, although it plays fairly loose with time. I'm sure you noticed that certain chapters that were titled with a year a lot of the references and flashbacks and discussions did not happen in that year. So, but the first half of the 20th century, roughly, is the setting, and we're in a small town in Ohio again, in sort of northern Ohio, up by the lake. So we're really not far from the fictional town of Winesburg, Ohio, as it was portrayed in Sherwood Anderson's novel. And I don't think it's important necessarily to realize that, but it certainly adds a layer to specifically our exploration of the rural, because we're sort of returning to an area and seeing it from a very different perspective. You know, the Weinsberg was all about sort of, I think, almost completely sort of rural, sometimes pre-industrial, almost always white farmers. And here we get things that happen sort of not too long after Weinsberg, up until even maybe 30 years after Weinsberg. But a very different experience, obviously, the black rural Midwestern experience, which, as you read the novel, is dissimilar in some ways and similar in other ways. There are certainly things that the citizens of Weinsberg and the citizens of the Bottoms have in common, sort of struggles that they both deal with. But then, of course, there are different struggles that are dealt with in this novel. For example, as we're going to talk about in a minute, when Eva gets on a train to travel, it's a very different experience with very different undertones than when, say, George Willard gets on a train to travel. So similar but different. And the novel, as I said about Morrison in general, is interested in the black experience, and specifically here the black rural experience, but it's also interested, as usual, as good literature is, in a number of other things. It's interested in gender roles and norms, and we sort of see female characters taking the lead. Most of the male characters in this novel are either somewhat checked out, or sort of half crazy, or just not very admirable in their actions. And the sort of grounding of this novel, the root of this novel, really is in the experience of a handful of black women. You have Eva, you have Sula, you have Hannah, you have Nell. That's really who the book is interested in. So we also get, I would say, not a different point of view than Weinsberg, because there are chapters of Weinsberg that deal with women's experience in the town. But we get a book that's more solely dedicated to this experience. We also, although sort of in the same way it was in Bless Me Ultima, it sort of in the background, we do get an exploration again of the effect of war on rural communities. We start with Shadrach coming back from the war, and he is sort of a minor character throughout the book, but it's important, I think, that the book starts with him returning from war, sort of setting the stage. More broadly, historically, it's interesting that this novel basically fills the interwar period, the space between World War I and World War II, where we as a nation were trying to even begin to make sense of what this new mechanized warfare that we found ourselves in even meant, and how we were supposed to view sort of the world through that new lens. The literary movement and the broader cultural and artistic movement that accompanies that is called modernism, and it's not important that you really know what modernism is start to finish, but one of the things modernism is really interested in is making sense of what truth is after something like World War I, where, you know, a lot of the truths we took for granted were sort of shattered by machine guns and tanks and all of these sorts of very impersonal, non-human things. So that isn't maybe central to the novel, but it serves as an important backdrop. So before we start with the chapters, there were actually a couple of short passages in the foreword that Morrison wrote for, I think, for this actual edition of Sula. That's what Toni Morrison gets to do now that she's written numerous famous American novels, is she gets to write new introductions that sort of frame them the way she wants, which is, I suppose, the right of a great and talented and well-published author. So at one point, I think on page 7 of the foreword, Morrison says that she rooted the narrative in a landscape already tainted by the fact that it existed. So I want you to think about what that means as you read. And also, she says at one point, "What is friendship between women when unmediated by men? What choices are available to black women outside of their own society's approval? What are the risks of individualism in a determinedly individualistic yet racially uniform and socially static community? So on one hand, this passage is interested in sort of gender norms and gender roles and what the risks are of moving outside of those. But the second half of this passage, what are the risks of individualism in a determinedly individualistic yet racially uniform and socially static community? This really gets to the heart of the rural. What risks are you taking by not being, quote, normal in a rural community? And I think that through the character of Sula largely, and some of the other characters as well, Morrison attempts to answer that question. But of course, we've seen that question asked in previous readings. You know, we see characters in Weinsberg that aren't normal and perhaps suffer because of that. We see even in Rip Van Winkle or Huckleberry Finn or Ethan Frome, certainly in Bless Me Ultima, what the risk is of not meeting the norms of a rural community specifically, which is much smaller and more closely knit than other communities. So, part one, which I suppose is really the title of the first half of the novel, but because there's no other title for the first section, that's what I'm calling it. It starts with a discussion of how things used to be in Medallion. It also describes how things have changed and developed. The quote that I pulled out, among others, is a reference that it's called the suburbs now. So the place that is more rural, certainly as the story begins, is almost all undeveloped farmland on the side of a hill. But even as the novel unfolds in the 20s and 30s and 40s, still not completely backwoods rural. There are streets and things in the town, but it's a small town, sort of what I imagine Weinsberg would have become later in the 20th century. And it doesn't start with one of our characters. It starts with this sort of camera zooming in. Now, Morrison spends some time in her intro talking about how she might not do it this way now, how this was sort of her way of familiarizing the town to maybe non-black or non-rural black characters or readers that wouldn't have recognized it, so she could sort of situate them. But I'm more interested in it as sort of the camera zooming in and letting us get a picture of the town as a whole before we start following around the characters, which we have, of course, seen before in some of our other novels. Ethan Frome, for example, did that pretty well with their "If you know Starkfield, you know the post office." But why does the narrative start here? I think it's for that reason. I think there are some other reasons as well. I mean, if you're going to write a rural novel, you have to ground us in the setting of the rural before we know where we're at. I also think it's worth noting that the Bottoms ends up on the hillside because the white landowner didn't want to give up good bottom farmland to his freed slave. And the novel talks about how it's sort of a joke, and it sets it up as sort of one more sort of privilege that the white character has over the black character. But I'm also very interested in this sort of joke that the Bottoms ends up on the hillside, because I think it connects to our understanding of land in the rural experience. And we've talked about land, I think, either in Bless Me Ultima or maybe toward the end of one of the other discussions in the forums. We talked specifically about how the role of land and geography figures into these stories for these characters. And I think the fact that the land here has been pushed up on the side of the hill and yet a life has still been made comments on the rural experience generally. The rural novel often focuses on characters that try to deal with uncooperative or unusual land. The Llano in Bless Me Ultima, the frozen tundra, basically, of Starkfield. A little bit later, we're going to read a novel called The Plague of Doves, about people who go out into the northern Midwest and plains as sort of explorers and try to tame the land there with mixed results at best. So I think while the symbolism of the Bottoms being on the hill works in a lot of different ways, one of the ways it works is that these people are starting with land that is still valuable to them, but more complicated than maybe other places would have to deal with. So it's interesting because when we read Sula, on one hand, you probably feel like you're getting a very different novel than we've seen so far. You probably feel like, you're getting a novel that focuses on the experiences of a race and a community that we haven't focused on up to this point. Um, but because you are sort of being trained in this class to read from a rural point of view, you're probably also seeing things that feel very familiar to you. And one of them we get early on in part one, after Shadrach has returned, and he sets up National Suicide Day, um, and not for the first or last time, the narrative camera sort of zooms out and gives us the point of view of what's happening here from the point of view of the town, which of course we've seen elsewhere. We've seen it in Ethan Frome. Xena was what Starkville called sickly, for example. Um, and here we get they, meaning the residents of Medallion, were mighty preoccupied with earthly things and each other, wondering even as early as 1920 what Shadrach was all about, what that little girl Sula who grew into a woman in their town was all about, and what they themselves were all about, tucked up there in the bottom. So once again, we get the point of view of the community. And how, I would ask you, is it useful, or maybe how does the frame of this story, how does the story being framed through the setting affect how we read the novel? Why is it important that this is not just the story of Sula, not just the story of Nell, but it's also the story of how the town views Sula and Nell and Shadrach and Eva? The town itself as a character is very interesting here and elsewhere that we have looked. And I think because of the fact that realistically the town can be a character in the way that it couldn't in a large city. Most people in a city aren't going to care about the little girl Sula who grew into a woman. But here, the town can realistically care, and that changes how we view the story. So I would encourage you to think about how, and maybe even on a final exam or a midterm exam or maybe an essay too, you could even write about how. And then we come to the first sort of specifically named chapter. They're all named for years. But 1919 is the first year we spend in the narrative, so to speak, although again, it sort of starts before that. Shadrach comes back from the war in 1919 and does some things. He doesn't go to war in 1919, even though that happens in the chapter. So it starts first, before Shadrach even leaves the war. We start with Shadrach being in the battle, on the battlefield, and horrible things happening, described pretty viscerally. And then he doesn't come home when he gets discharged. He gets injured a little bit and gets put in a hospital. And in the hospital, he sort of temporarily loses his mind. Sort of what we may recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder, although in 1919 there was no such term. So he's hospitalized, and then eventually he's released from the hospital and finds his way back to Medallion. And if this also felt familiar, it's because he's basically going through what the brothers went through in Bless Me Ultima. Antonio's brothers were fighting in World War II, but they returned, and they weren't quite right. So my first question for you would be, how does Shadrach's return seem similar to their return? And I think the similarity is that both of them are just not quite equipped to return home. They have some serious experiences and issues to sort through and to deal with. And when they return, they are not who they were when they left, which of course is true of almost anyone who goes to war. But again, it's probably more noticeable in a small town where people, sort of recognize him. They recognize him actually because his father, or maybe it was his grandfather, had a shack on the river that he moves into, and so his history is known here, and he doesn't seem to fit his history. Of course, it doesn't hurt that he's also establishing things like National Suicide Day and being sort of overtly bizarre at times. But I think it's also worth noting how Shadrach's return is different than Antonio's brothers. Antonio's brothers came back, and honestly, with the exception of Andrew, were kind of jerks, right? They just weren't listening to their dad. They couldn't stay. And I think that's the key. The brothers couldn't wait to get out of their hometown. Here, though, Shadrach returns, and it says he saw a window that looked out on a river, which he knew was full of fish. Someone was speaking softly just outside the door. His return is actually sort of precipitated or facilitated by his memory of home and wanting to return to this window. In fact, it refers to it as his window, his river, his soft voices just outside the door. So there's a sense of ownership of this place for Shadrach, whereas for Antonio's brothers, their return home was fruitless. They didn't want to be there. They didn't feel a part of it anymore. For Shadrach, the return is actually, I would argue, what sort of starts to heal him. And so the idea of the small town as a place that people can't wait to get away from, which we've talked about before, is definitely personified in Antonio's brothers. But here there's a different kind of character that we're encountering. The character that must return to their roots, to their small town, to their rural upbringing, to be whole again, to be healed. And I think that in some ways, is a less familiar and more interesting character, and I would encourage you to keep an eye out for those types of characters as we continue reading. So a final quick thought on Shadrach and the town and his return. This isn't really the focus of the novel, but there's a lot going on in this section that's very interesting to studying it from a rural perspective. And it says, once the people understood the boundaries and nature of Shadrach's madness, they could fit him, so to speak, into the scheme of things. So his first National Suicide Day was a complete sort of freaked out weirdness for the town. But by the second or third or fourth one, it's a thing that they've sort of adopted and internalized into the town. What does this tell us about Shadrach's reintegration into the town and about the town itself? The fact that once they understood Shadrach and his madness, then they could fit him into the scheme of things in the town of Medallion. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that for Shadrach to be reintegrated, the town had to make sense of him. And this, again, feels very rural. You can go to New York City and be a crazy person all the time and sort of exist there. I don't know that you would have the most fulfilling life, but New York is sort of famous for accepting people that aren't quite what we expect. Here, though, Shadrach really becomes reintegrated not once he conforms to the town necessarily, but once the town conforms to him, I guess you would say. But whichever direction the sign goes, conformity has to sort of take place for everything to be okay again. And that, I think, tells us as much about the town itself as it does about Shadrach. So as I'm looking at the slides that I've sort of put together for the first half of Sula, I'm realizing that they, and by extension I, am in some ways much more interested in the sort of presentation of the rural in the beginning of this novel than what's actually happening plot-wise. And I think that's perfectly appropriate for a class that's focused on the rural. But for those of you who tuned in looking for, here's what happens in the novel, I'm not giving you much of that. Partially because I don't think this is a particularly complicated novel as far as plot goes. The characters do what they do. It's pretty apparent what they're doing. Usually fairly apparent why they're doing it. So I'm really delving into the background here. And so even when we get into the story of Nell and her mother, I'm really interested in sort of what's going on in the corners, what's painted in the corners, not the main focus of the chapters. So we get this passage, for example, in sort of letting us start to get to know Nell and her mother. When Nell is very small, we are told any enthusiasms that little Nell showed were calmed by the mother until she drove her daughter's imagination underground. And this is just sort of one of those passages I circle like 3 times and put 5 stars next to, right? So I feel like we're getting such an important aspect of the rural. Not that every mother acts this way toward their children, but that this sort of mindset is in the world of the rural, where conformity and fitting in often is important, and that there are consequences if you don't fit in. That's often okay with characters, but the idea here is that any enthusiasms is sort of a euphemism here for maybe too much excitement, or getting more excited about things than one should, or at least more than everybody else in the town does, or being interested in other things that most people in the town aren't. So when Nell showed these sorts of enthusiasms, they were calmed by her mother. And I suspect that the mother is doing it because there's this sort of hardwired sense that Nell needs to be like the other people here. Although that's very interesting considering that Nell's mother isn't in some ways like everyone else in the town. But this is a concern in the rural particularly because, again, you sort of do know most people and most people know you. So you can be a free spirit in a rural environment. Certainly, we probably, all of us from rural backgrounds, know those people. But then you also have to think about how those people are viewed, right? Maybe not negatively, but certainly differently. Um, One of the interesting things, if we're going to do a close reading, and I encourage you again and again and again to do close reading, you're going to take a midterm exam soon that is going to focus on close reading and being able to look at passages and tease meaning out of not just what that passage says, but how the word choice even affects it. And here we get the word calmed. The enthusiasms were calmed by the mother. They weren't suppressed. They weren't beaten down. They weren't rejected. They were calmed. So how does the choice of the word calmed affect what we're learning here about the mother and the town? And I think one way to read it, not the only way, is that if the town views itself as calming seems to be for someone's good, right? If someone's freaking out and you sort of hold them down until they're calm, you calm them, you're sort of protecting them, right? Keeping them from hurting themselves. So that verb choice here suggests not that the town is sort of domineering or punishing, but that the town seems to think it wants what's best in the character of the mother here, for example. The mother calms Nell's enthusiasms. Calming is good. Calming makes everything better. Now, we can certainly disagree with whether that's actually true or not, but the narrative suggests that the town at least views itself, and the mother at least views herself, as doing a service to people by sort of making them not too unusual in the town. So I point that out not only to bring to your attention another aspect of the rural in this novel, but to say, do this kind of work. Do this when you read. Look for those specific little moments. Those are the things that are really going to make the bells and whistles go off in your papers and exams, showing that you can really parse these moments that help prove your points, not just that you can tell me generally what happens in a novel. So there's your close reading lesson for the day. So one of the major events early in the book is the trip from Medallion to New Orleans. Nell and her mother go. Nell's mother was born in New Orleans in a brothel and escaped north when she married her distant cousin, I think it was. So she has memories of this place, and they return because her grandmother, I think, is dying. When they arrive, she's already died. But anytime you get a trip in a rural novel, what happens fairly instantly is that you start to compare. And I think that's useful here. So how does this trip differentiate between, say, North and South, right? So it's not that there isn't racism in the North, for example, but certainly as they travel south, it becomes more blatant and less easy to overlook. Certainly the scene where they have to go out into the field to use the restroom would be a great example of that. How does it differentiate between urban and rural? New Orleans is one of the great sort of urban spaces in the United States, and it was at this time. And it's a very different place than Medallion. We also get this very interesting moment where Nell's mother says to her, "I don't talk Creole," even though we had just seen that she did, and neither do you. And this is very interesting because it seems to be something of a rejection of the urban, right? The urban here is connected to speaking Creole because there is no Creole speaking in Medallion, and yet here it is happening in New Orleans. Now, geographically, certainly people speak Creole in all sorts of rural places in Louisiana, but here it's being linked with New Orleans because that's where Nell hears it. And the rejection of it, and Nell's mother's rejection of Creole as an artifact of her life in the city, feels sort of like a rejection of the dangers and the unpleasantness of the rural in favor of the urban, in favor of the rural life that they have built in Ohio. But then when we return home, we learn this about Nell. It says, but she had gone on a real trip, and now she was different. Why? Why was Nell different? Well, Nell wasn't really different, but she felt different because she had gone out and seen the world. She had seen the city. We also learn that she never leaves Medallion again, so it's sort of a bittersweet realization for her. But where have we seen this before? once again, the idea of getting out of the small town and seeing the world as something that makes you a different and maybe even a better person. So many people in Weinsberg wanted to do that. Some people in Weinsberg did it. Ethan Frome wanted to do it. Um, Antonio's brothers did it, and it affected them badly. But there's always this idea of getting out and seeing the world if you grow up rural, and becoming a more complete person or a better person or just a different person. Um, and here it really does sort of, I'm going to say, infect Nell, and not in a bad way, not like a virus necessarily, but it really does change how she feels about where she is. And I think that is both the promise and the danger of seeing the larger world for someone who grows up rural. So in the 1921 chapter, we've shifted focus from Nell and her mother to Eva, and eventually Eva's children, including Hannah and Plum. And it starts with Eva marrying Boy Boy, and then Boy Boy leaves her, sort of unceremoniously, which is not unusual anywhere, but certainly in rural environments, the necessities of economy and lack of education and those sorts of things can lead to divorce rates being higher, or I don't even know that they got divorced here as much as he just left. Um, Leaves her with three small children, and at first she has no money, she has no livelihood, and she has to basically beg to survive. She relies on the charity of the community. And we get this passage, which I think strikes a nice balance between what we've seen elsewhere about the interaction between the individual and the community. People were very willing to help, but Eva felt she would soon run out her welcome. And I would ask you, sort of, how does this fit our evolving sense of rural people helping support each other? So, in Weinsberg, there were lots of people who were willing to take interest in and help each other, and even people that were down on their luck had people who cared about them. In Bless Me Ultima, I mean, the communities, it was expected that the community was constantly helping each other. Ultima lives because they take her in. Other people live because Ultima helps them. Ethan Frome, a little bit different, right? Ethan thinks about asking someone for money or for help, but the book says something along the lines of everybody had troubles of their own. They didn't have much extra concern for other people's troubles, right? And I think in some ways this passage in Sula might be the most realistic approach to it, because it sort of strikes the balance between those two. That yes, people will tend to give you the shirt off their back in a small town if you are of that small town, but they will not do it indefinitely. And I think maybe Bless Me Ultima paints everything as slightly rosier than reality. Ethan Frome, it seems harder than reality. Here, I feel like it's almost, the first bowl of porridge is too cold, the second bowl of porridge is too hot. This one is just right. I feel like this sort of suggests that both realities are true. People in rural places are initially very helpful and giving, but they are probably not going to take care of you forever, because there also is that sort of blue collar work ethic that you need to make your own way in a rural culture. So I bring that up to sort of show another facet of that particular discussion. So a couple more things to look at in the 1921 chapter. We learn a lot about Eva's house, and how after Boy Boy leaves, she sort of has this new house built down the road from where the old one was. And once she builds it, she populates it, not just with her own three children, but with newlyweds and boarders, people that pay to stay there temporarily. She adopts these boys, and sort of just lets them come and live there, even though they are not blood relatives. And the symbolism of Eva's house is it can take on a lot of meaning, and I think there are probably a dozen ways to discuss the symbolism of the house based on what you're interested in the novel. One of the things I want to look at is how can we compare this central structure to the ones that we see in other texts. So what came to mind almost immediately because of the borders was the hotel in Winesburg, Ohio, that George Willard's parents run. But also I think the church or the school, I think they might have even been the same building, in Bless Me Ultima. The idea that there is this single sort of structure that is the hub, that is the center of the town in a rural space. And I think this is another thing that is somewhat particularly rural. Um, every small town has the sort of uh, these days it's often a restaurant, just sort of a hole in the wall, greasy spoon type restaurant where everybody goes to sort of hear the news that's going on. But here in this town, Eva's house is sort of that structure. And I think I would ask you to consider, I don't have an answer for you, but consider why is this particularly important in a rural environment to have this sort of crossroads space, this structure that is at least part public space. Um, Another thing that comes up in this chapter is what I call the relatively free sexuality of Eva and Hannah, certainly compared to the view of sex in other texts we've read. How does it compare? Within the house, Eva sort of has her gentleman callers, and she sort of attracts them, even though we're told that they don't actually engage in any sort of sexual activity. Hannah, on the other hand, sort of does so freely with many of the men in the town. And I think that Toni Morrison sets this up as sort of a commentary on the fact that traditionally, people who do this are viewed negatively. We have lots of words in the English language for people, but women specifically who engage in this sort of activity. And I think Morrison is pushing back against that a little bit. Hannah is sort of a fully formed character who is not necessarily bad or evil. She just likes to do this. But certainly in a rural space particularly, the reaction to this is going to be negative. And it's largely negative in other texts that we've read. If you think of Ethan Frome, right, Hannah and Maddie have sort of something in common, although Maddie is only interested in Ethan, whereas Hannah is interested in everyone. And in Ethan Frome, that's the major tension of the novel, is that they both know they shouldn't be doing this. Ethan is married. And yet here, Hannah has no such qualms. She feels no need to hide things. I suppose she goes into less occupied rooms of the house occasionally, but that's about it. But then we do get this, because at first it feels like sort of almost unbelievable in a small town. But then we hear that outside of the house, where children giggled about underwear, the message was different. So the suggestion here is that the small town itself is still very conservative in this way, still very traditional in that this is looked down upon. But because of the point of view that Morrison gives us in the novel, and that we are not, I think, expected to dislike Hannah, even if we don't agree with what she's doing, it presents this activity on a personal level through a very different viewpoint than we have seen before. And yet, there is that tension between her actions in the house and the broader town of Medallion. And certainly, when you think of what happens to Hannah, an argument could be made that she gets what she deserves, but I think that would be a reductive analysis. I think that the novel itself doesn't really hold her responsible for her choices. It simply reports them. And that's a very different attitude toward physicality and sex than we get in pretty much any other book we've read. I mean, if you think of the brothel in Bless Me Ultima, it was really a place of evil. I mean, it was full of red light, and the symbolism was pretty heavy. And here, not that Eva's house is a brothel exactly, but it's certainly a place where similar things happen with Hannah. I don't think the text judges it in the same way, and I think that's a difference worth noting. And so, as the narrative continues and develops in the chapter titled 1922, we start to see the friendship develop between Eva and Sula. And certainly, from a plot point of view and from a character point of view, there are lots of developments. But as they start going out into the town and we start getting a sense of the town through their eyes, we get this fairly long passage, longer than most I've read in this presentation, but another one that I think is worth looking at. Sort of in the main street of the town here, of Medallion. Old men and young ones draped themselves in front of the Elmira Theater, Irene's Palace of Cosmetology, the pool hall, the grill, and the other sagging business enterprises that lined the street. On sills, on stoops, on crates and broken chairs, they sat, tasting their teeth. That's a great turn of phrase. And waiting for something to distract them. Every passerby, every motor car, every alteration in stance caught their attention and was commented on. how does this passage, and then it goes on to talk about how these men are mostly looking for attractive women to walk by, which is not entirely unexpected. Um, but how does this passage, without worrying about the looking for the women part, fit our understanding of the rural? And I would encourage you to compare this to the opening passages of the novel, where we are being given that bird's eye view of the town as sort of a general town. And here we're getting it a little more up close, but we're still getting a sense of it as a collection of people. We're not following a person or individual characters at this moment. The town itself almost seems to be a living entity again. And I think that that is a defining characteristic of many rural novels, that the town plays a role the same way that the main character plays a role, that a supporting character plays a role. The town becomes a supporting character. They're interested, they're watching, the town is watching. Not necessarily in a disturbing or a Halloween story sort of way, but just in the town itself, because it's large enough to be a corporate entity, but not so large that it has much of a diversity of opinions. I almost think of the towns in books like Bless Me Ultima and Ethan Frome and Weinsberg and Sula as a character that sits and watches and reacts. Then, as this chapter continues, we see Nell and Sula become friends, and the text makes it fairly clear that Nell and Sula become friends because they are both lonely, that they both have lonely early childhoods, and so that they sort of know each other before they ever meet, because in each other they recognize sort of kindred spirits. Um, and I think that, again, we get a reflection of the rural experience in that anyone who is a little different, whether it's Nell and her desire to leave the town and see the world after New Orleans, or Sula and her just sort of general difference, not only because of her upbringing, but because of who she becomes as we read the second half of the novel for next week. People who are different often are isolated, and they do turn to their imagination. And when they find each other, it's a very strong bond because there aren't 100 people in the town like them, the way there would be in a larger population. So in some ways, the central relationship of this novel between Nell and Sula is an expression of the rural experience. They are welded together, not out of necessity exactly. They don't have to be friends, but they are the likely friend for each other given how few people like them are present in a smaller town like this. And then we jump forward as they are friends. We follow them through the town. We have the interaction with the boys on the street. And then they're out one day just sort of doing what they do. And they come across Chicken Little, the little boy who is out in the river. And they put him up in the tree so that he can see. And he's fascinated. And they play with him. And Sula is holding his hands and spinning him. She accidentally lets go. He slips out of her hands. He flies out into the river and drowns. And this is sort of I would say the biggest event of the section that we have read for today, the tragedy of Chicken Little's passing. And nobody learns that they were responsible, although they suspect Shadrach might know about it. But when they go to check, he's very strange, and we don't really get a sense of whether he saw it or not. But then we follow them to the funeral, where they still are keeping their silence about what they know. And at the funeral, we get another one of those sort of descriptions of the people, more as a group than as individuals. And we are told that at the funeral for Chicken Little, who is a young boy, they feel, quote, the oldest and most devastating pain there is, not the pain of childhood, but the remembrance of it. And when I read that this time, and I don't know that I had made this connection before, but now that I'm teaching these books in sort of sequence, it jumps out at me. How does this fit with our idea of rural innocence? For Antonio, for example, in Bless Me Ultima, the idea that Antonio is losing his innocence means that he is no longer a child, that he is losing his innocence as he ceases to be a boy. In Weinsberg, specifically, maybe this is what jumped out at me most clearly, is in Weinsberg, the thing that keeps you from being a grotesque is that you maintain your youth. You maintain some childlike aspect to yourself. And yet here, remembering childhood is the most devastating pain there is. And the suggestion, I think, is not that childhood itself was painful, but that realizing that we have lost it and that we can't get it back is the pain. Now, Weinsberg, I think, would argue that we can hold on to some fundamental aspect of it. I think Sula argues otherwise. That, and I think to some extent, Bless Me Ultima does as well. That the great loss of childhood is a profoundly affecting experience for all of us. And I suspect that the symbolism and the foreshadowing here is because they have been involved in the death of Chicken Little, even if it was an accident, that innocence, that childhood is being taken away from Nell and Sula here. Okay, I almost didn't include the first part of this slide. Not because I don't think it's important, but because I don't have much commentary on it. It literally is just some questions I want to ask you and let you think about. I don't know the answer to these questions. But when Hannah goes upstairs to Eva and asks her, "Did you love us?" or some version of that, and Eva sort of responds indignantly and gets really upset with her for even asking that, and all while sort of admitting that no, she really didn't love her children in the way that Hannah loves her children, or that people love children. Actually, Hannah says that she loves Sula but doesn't like her, and that's a whole other thing that I think affects Sula. But the idea that the way we love our children today, or even the way people loved their children at this moment, was not the way Eva loved her children, or not the way maybe the people of an earlier generation did. And I feel like I have a sense of this more generally, even growing up in a rural place, that the older people I remember when I was younger, it's not that we didn't get a sense that they loved us, grandparents, great grandparents, but that they certainly didn't baby us. They didn't engage us lovingly the way that maybe our parents did. And the question, I suppose, is how much of that is just a product of upbringing. I'm talking, when I talk about people in my own experience, and I think this would be even a little earlier. If we're in 1923 and then they're flashing back to Eva when the kids were younger, you're talking about, the 19 teens. These are people living through some very hard circumstances. I remember my grandparents and my great-grandmother specifically living through the Great Depression. That doesn't leave a lot of time for blatant affection. You're too busy trying to survive, right? So how is love viewed in rural places? I don't have an answer to that. And I think it's different depending on the place, and I think that it is different depending on the time. Certainly love would have had to take a back seat during the Depression, or at least outward expressions and sort of the corporate Valentine's card sort of culture that we think of today with love. How has it changed over time? And as a result, with Eva saying, I didn't have time to play with you because I was busy keeping you alive, how central is what I'm calling the back in the day mentality to the rural experience? And what I mean by that, we've all heard it. Back in the day, I had to walk 10 miles to school uphill both ways, right? It's sort of a joke at this point. And yet, this idea that the previous generation, especially in rural settings, had it exponentially harder than people do now, or people do in a later generation, I think is related to the idea of love and having time for things like that, but it's also just a general consequence of the rural experience. I always tell people that I grew up in a house with indoor plumbing and most of the things that anybody would have had anywhere. We didn't have cable TV until I was a teenager. I guess that's my claim to hardship when I was younger. And yet I was only really one generation, maybe two, removed from people who had to go to an outhouse to use the restroom, people who went out into their yards and killed an animal if they wanted meat for dinner. And so the back in the day mentality, while it has become a bit of a punchline, I think is an important consideration when looking at the rural. Eva seems like a hard woman in this book, and yet she is a hard woman made hard by hard circumstance. And I think Morrison wants us to have not sympathy for her, but understanding of her. Certainly, for example, she sets Plum, her son, on fire rather than let him become a child again, which also feeds into our discussion of childhood and loss of childhood from the last slide. I wouldn't dream of arguing that she is not guilty of something horrible there, and yet, given her background and given the insight into her Morrison gives us through the point of view, I understand it. approve of it or condone it. It makes me rather sick to think of. And yet, I get it. I get why it happens. You are a product of your upbringing. And rural life, I mean, think of Jesse Bentley in Weinsberg, raised sort of in the late 1800s, before the Industrial Revolution. He's a hard man too. And he's a hard man partially because he was raised in a hard environment. Even as I'm explaining this, I hear myself not staying quite as on track as I normally do on these slides, and yet I think it's important to touch on this, even if I don't have answers. I just want to bring it to your attention and encourage you to look for these moments of how the hardness of rural upbringing can affect people in a rural space. And the other question here, and I actually, now that I'm looking at it and as I've narrated this, I realize I'm sort of just hitting again something we've touched on with the opening passage giving us a sense of the town, and then the passage from a couple of slides ago with the men all lining up and watching everything that's happening on the main street. But I ask you here why it's important that we're forced to view the death of Hannah through the eyes of the community. So when she dies and falls on the ground, we don't get just Eva's point of view. It starts with that. We don't get Hannah's point of view. We don't hear about how much pain she's in. We don't get in her head. We don't really get Sula's point of view, although we know she's standing there watching it. We get everybody else on the street surrounding her and watching her, and that's how this tragedy is presented to us. So again, this is a book that wants us to see things not up close and personal one-on-one, but through the eyes of the town. It casts us often as someone standing on the street watching these things unfold. And I think that's important for understanding Sula as a rural novel. This is a novel that is very much about the tension between the individual and the community, and we are often cast in the role of community. And finally, the first half of the reading, the reading for this week from the first half of Sula ends with a bit of a jump forward in time. Nell and Sula are older now. They're fast friends, but we learn that Nell is getting married. She's getting married to Jude. In fact, when the section starts, I believe that they've already been married. It sort of starts in media res at the wedding reception in the home of Nell's mother. And then Morrison sort of slowly pulls us out and gives us a little bit of the backstory as to how we arrived at this wedding. And we learn that Jude decides to marry Nell because he wants to be a man. He wants to not work in a restaurant the rest of his life. He wants to work on the new highway they're building. And part of being a man, he thinks, is getting married. And we could certainly dissect to an extensive degree the extent to which that is sort of a gender norm or a gender expectation. But in the world of this novel, that's what Jude wants. I don't necessarily think the novel wants us to see it as the best reason to get married, as much as just his motivation. But we get this wonderful little moment. And Jude, in the first half, isn't really a central character. We just meet him at the end. But we learn a lot about him quickly. And we learn his attitude toward wanting to go out and work on this road as compared to working in a restaurant. And it says, more than anything, Jude wanted the camaraderie of the roadmen, the lunch buckets, the hollering, the body movement that in the end produced something real, something he could point to. I built that road, he could say. Strange thing to want. I think in today's world, we don't necessarily think of going out and doing hot road work as something we would sort of put at the top of our priority list. And yet here, it's really what Jude wants. And I think this comments on the role of blue-collar work in the rural, that it is valued in the rural cultures, even of today, more highly than it is anywhere else. In fact, non-blue-collar work is sometimes still viewed sort of distrustfully in rural spaces, and certainly at this time in this novel, it was hugely important. And yet, it's denied to him. And the novel makes it pretty clear. It is denied to him because he is black. That we are in a place and a time where the white men that come and do the hiring for the road project will pick the less qualified, less athletic, less physically strong white workers over the most likely better qualified black workers for road work. And so the sort of inherent racism of the place creeps in here. And then we have to consider what is the effect of that denial. We don't really get to see it right here, but we certainly get a sense that as it is denied to him, this desire to become a man and do a man's work and have a man's wife is maybe not going to go as well because he can't fully complete the fantasy that he is having. We'll have to wait till next week, though, to see what the effect of that is on Nell and maybe by extension Sula. So that's the end of the discussion for this week. Finish Sula for next week and watch next week's presentation when it rolls around. Ask any questions you have in the FAQ. Make sure you take part in the discussion threads this week, and I appreciate your time and attention.